Hi, thank you for joining. I'm Susie Simpson, a partner with PwC UK, and I'm also the DE&I lead for the Institute of Directors in Scotland. I am delighted to have so many of you joining us today for this discussion on allyship and inclusion. And I will just let our audience build up for a couple of moments and we'll get started shortly. And just whilst we're waiting, I can tell you that if you prefer to add captions to this audio live, you can add them by clicking the three dots at the top right-hand side of this event pop-up. And do please leave questions in the comments box on the event invite. We will be keeping an eye out for those to ask them during the session. Okay, right, let's get started. As I said, I'm Susie Simpson, a partner with PwC UK, and I'm also the DE&I lead for the Institute of Directors in Scotland. This is the second collaboration I've been lucky enough to do with the Institute of Directors and PwC on all things DE&I. And I am really pleased to have a fantastic panel with me today to discuss allyship in business. I should say that I am in the very first stage of my learning on allyship. I will confessions time, I guess, that I thought I was a good ally. And until I started this process of reflection, I realised that I've actually got quite a long way to go. So I hope that some of those on the call today will identify a bit with that and join me on my journey. I have at least started that process of reflecting, of recognising my privilege and understanding it. And I've loved that journey. It's been uncomfortable at times, but I want to use this session to give us all, I hope, some key tangible actions and takeaways to accelerate us all along our personal journeys. So I am joined by three brilliant individuals who are much further along that journey towards allyship than I am. I will ask my guests to introduce themselves because they'll do a much better job of it than I will. Very briefly, we have Phil Patterson, PwC Partner, colleague of mine, who is sponsor for our disability network. We have Fiona Meyer, DE&I and anti-racism consultant, who I have had the absolute pleasure of getting to know as part of my Institute of Director role, and I've learnt huge amounts from that. And Binby McCory, occupational therapist and neurodiversity trainer, who is passionate about training for businesses in what neurodiversity is. So a wonderfully broad, I think, intersectional experience that we can share on allyship. Then by coming to you first, we'll come on to what allyship really means, the sort of definition of allyship in a minute. But I just wondered if you could perhaps introduce yourself and say, maybe in one sentence, there's a challenge for you. Could you give us an example of where you have personally felt the real power of allyship in your life to date? And then maybe pass on to Fiona and on to Phil.
Thank you so much, Susannah, for that introduction. So my name is Binby McCory. I have over 10 years experience as an occupational therapist, and I'm now a neurodiversity trainer and diagnostician for autism. And I also work with individuals and businesses to support with their neurodiverse colleagues. So I guess a brief introduction of myself. To go into an example where I have experienced allyship myself, it was very early on in my career as an occupational therapist. And if you know anything about occupational therapy, you would know that it's usually dominated by white middle-class females. There wasn't much diversity when I first qualified. And I wanted to specialize in pediatrics, which was a specialism. So it wasn't a job that was quite widely open. It was one of those roles where if it's advertised, it goes very quickly and you have to have experience to get into it. So anyone who's a new graduate would know what that feels like. And so anyway, I applied for several roles, which I didn't get. The role that I did get, it was because I had been recommended by my supervisor, who was a white male. So he had connections, and he also knew how good I was at the job. So that was, to me, a great example of allyship, where somebody spoke on my behalf, gave me a voice, allowed me an opportunity, which has excelled my career. It's the best job I ever had, that opportunity. So that was my example of allyship used in the best way possible.
I love that. Fiona, can I come on to you?
Absolutely. So yes, Fiona Meyer. I'm an anti-racism and D&I consultant, and I specialize in supporting organizations to implement their recommendations through taking your whole organization through an anti-racism or D&I education, training, long-term program. And part of that is really about the accountability journey, the impact, and just addressing the uncomfortable and moving forward towards what we need to do. In terms of allyship is definitely something that pops up a lot. And the question that people tend to ask is, how can I be a good ally? So the book that I will recommend at the end, is a great book. It's a fantastic book to read because it takes people away from that need to center self when it comes to allyship. So when we think about the definition of allyship, it's really about that you're listening to marginalized group individuals, you're learning from the individuals, and then it's that yielding of power and privilege and actually being consistent in the action that you take. So it's about being active, not passively listening and learning, which is what people do. But the bit that people struggle with is that active, that, you know, what do we do in the workplace when we see and recognize that, you know, opportunities are not fair for people based on either the characteristic, based on their background, the neurodiversity, etc. So what do you do with that? How do you yield power? How do you use privilege? And privilege is something that I would love to talk about, because that really fits in when it comes to understanding allyship. It's you have to tap into some uncomfortable truths and then use that to make sure that we are creating a fair playing field.
Fiona, I love that, and I think you've just given us the full definition of ally. Have you got an example of something, a personal experience of yours where you felt and benefited from allyship?
Is that for myself? Oh gosh, I've got a few, but I would say in terms of, especially being in this industry of diversity and inclusion and anti-racism, although I've been in spaces where I've been invited to speak, my experience at times had been tokenistic of, you know, you're in that space and you're providing your lived experience. However, through time, I have met individuals and allies who have opened doors, just as we were discussing behind the scene conversation with Binby, that key opportunity to open doors and really be supportive in progressing the future people moving forward, not simply creating, for example, internships. There's a lot of internships, but once a person's inside that space, is that opportunity to progress forward. And these are the experiences that I've had of getting back into my career as a returner. I've had many labels, returner, BAME returner, etc. And I've had individuals in my life who have seen my potential and have been there to speak on my behalf in spaces that I've not accessed, and then being able to get in there. So that for me is allyship, is really having that open the doors or windows and making sure that people do progress forward and be a part of that journey with them.
I love that sort of active versus tokenistic, which is the two expressions we'll hold on to. Phil, your turn.
Well, hi, I'm Phil Patterson. I'm a partner in our audit practice. Professionally, I am a chartered accountant, and partially through my own journey with neurodiversity, I realised that I'm probably much better suited to the creativity that comes with innovating our audits and the use of data and technology than I am in actually adding up the numbers that go into an audit. Personally, I am a neurodiverse father of a neurodiverse family. We have 3 boys, one of whom has autism and a very severe speech and language disorder, and our middle boy is diagnosed with ADHD. My passion is really that I lead the PwC UK People Network, or Employee Resource Group, called Dawn, which is focused on disability and neurodiversity. And through this network, I have had the honour and privilege of hearing the stories of individuals, managers, leaders, parents, carers and clients around their stories of disability and neurodiversity, both at home and in the workplace. And I have the opportunity to make some small changes in people's lives, which hopefully can lead to their success and enablement. From an experience perspective in terms of allyship, I suppose I was probably 10 years into my career here, and probably stalling a little bit, struggling with feedback around being difficult or a perfectionist or arrogant or challenging to work with. And a partner took me aside and he said to me, rather than having a performance conversation, he said to me, I think you're a little bit like me. I'm not really going to talk to you about who I am or what I'm talking about me, but I think you're a little bit like me, and I think you should consider where you are on the spectrum. And I always knew I was dyslexic, but having that challenge, that open space conversation to then kind of go away and think about where do I fit in and how do I interact socially and think maybe a little bit differently from others, and then use the journey of my children to really learn about myself and be a bit more open about who I am.
Phil, that's an incredibly personal story from you, and I love it. It really brings that to life for me. I come on to Binby because actually before we came on air and in some of our preparation, you mentioned something that really struck me, and it's about how we need people who are neurodiverse to feel that they can ask for a diagnosis and be supported. The experience, as Phil has suggested it, how important is that, that sort of environment that we can actively help create that kind of a supportive culture and promote allyship, in your view?
So just giving you a brief description of what neurodiversity is, because I would say I'm a neurodiverse person, even though I haven't had any formal diagnoses. Sometimes we use terms that other people don't actually understand what they mean. So neurodiversity just means the range in way different people's brains works. So the main conditions that people hear of are ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, autism, but there's also things like Tourette's and OCD. There's a lot of conditions that are all combined within the umbrella of being neurodiverse. In the UK, it is thought that 15 to 20% of people are diagnosed. So even though you may hear in the media that people are being overdiagnosed, it's nonsense in my perspective. If only 15 to 20% of people are diagnosed within the UK, a first world country, with 10% being dyslexic, 6% dyspraxic, 5% ADHD, and 1 to 2% autistic, that's actually a very low percentage of people who are actually diagnosed. In my opinion, having working as a diagnostician, most people aren't, like what Phil said, have an awareness that they're different, that there's something about them that feels different to other people, that they see things differently, they think differently, they learn differently. But most people aren't diagnosed for a range of different reasons, whether it's lack of awareness, lack of resources, stigma, cultural beliefs. I come from a cultural background where, my family are all in healthcare, but as soon as I mentioned to my mom that I thought I had ADHD, she was like, oh, God forbid. She's more than happy to work as a nurse and all the rest of it, but the idea of it being something that we experience in a family. And so all those barriers affect people from being diagnosed. So when I hear someone like Phil say that within his family, they've got this lovely range of conditions, I think that's brilliant, because having the awareness means you're able to support people. Going back to your question, Susannah, the sheer fact that most people are not aware of their conditions means that they don't even ask for the support. And if you have any awareness of people who are neurodiverse, they're hypersensitive to a lot of things, which means where they're not also supported to excel, because they're expected to just perform how everybody else performs. If we work in an open plan office, that's how everyone else is supposed to work. If the training is provided via video or via PowerPoint, that's how you're supposed to. And so it affects people's performance, which means that most people actually may even struggle to stay in jobs. So I guess it's important, I guess, from a business perspective, to just be inclusive, not to focus on the diagnosis, but just to provide an inclusive way of working. So that means offering everybody an opportunity to have reasonable adjustments, because people don't have to have a diagnosis to have reasonable adjustments. If we see a wheelchair, we naturally think, oh, was there any stairs? But actually, you shouldn't have to see a wheelchair to are you able to access a building, for example, from a visual perspective? So just allowing accessibility, making sure the rooms are allow for people to work in quieter spaces, allowing people to have decompression days, so that people are not having to take days off if they're feeling overwhelmed. Having open discussions instead of making too many suggestions, asking, what do you think? Most people who are neurodiverse have so many ideas. You can tell by the way me and Phil speak, quite tangential. That means there's a lot going on in our brains. So sometimes just opening up that space means that you allow people like us, who may or may not be diagnosed, to be able to express what their experience is and share ideas of how to be more inclusive within that workplace? I probably didn't answer your question. I probably went
that's absolutely spot on, Binby. I love that, and I think, and it kind of brings me very nicely into some really the positives. And I want to start with some positive examples, and maybe come back to the barriers around successful examples of initiatives that businesses can take. And I know we do a lot of sort of sharing experiences and videos and just education, around what people's experiences are. I suppose from a kind of specificity, which is how I kind of work. And I had some quite good, very good training recently on how I might confront someone to share the impact of their behaviour, and being very specific about how I felt, how their actions impacted on me, and the potential impact. I was then the beneficiary of an individual, a fellow partner of mine, who called me up after a conversation where he thought I had been made to feel uncomfortable with a comment as a female joining a call that was made before. I didn't actually hear the comment before I joined the call. But if I'd had that training earlier, I would have recognised, I guess, it can't have been easy for him making that call to me. He offered to act as an advocate. And I had a hugely increased respect for him after that. So I think that kind of how do you confront things, and giving people a mechanism to do that, to my mind, is quite specific and action-based. It's something, it's not going to solve everything, but it is something that I was able to hold on to. So I don't know whether, maybe Fiona, will come on to you. Do you have any specific examples, a bit like Binby shared, where businesses can take some kind of tangible initiatives to address this in a good way?
Absolutely. And Binby, just to say, fellow dyslexic here, so we're all in one. For example, some of the organizations that I've worked with who've taken the whole organization through the anti-racism program, and especially in the third sector, are now looking into how to make their spaces, in terms of funding, how to make that more inclusive of other communities, especially in terms of what, Binby, everything that you described there. There's an intersectionality to allyship and to inclusion, that we need to understand that, people coming in from different cultures, different backgrounds, they, think and process, forms, content differently. So as funders, how do you create that space to be inclusive? So creating videos, application rather than written application, creating audio application rather than, again, written application, and then also removing, if you've done any funding application, I don't know if anyone's experienced that in here or on a call, it's an absolute nightmare. You have to know the language and the code and,
yes,
all of that stuff behind the scenes. So understanding that and then removing those kind of barriers for individuals, but you have to do the listing. So I suppose for organizations, there might be people in here at the beginning. So having high level action to take might feel a bit might put people off, but start off with really doing listening within your organization. Yeah. So surveys, anonymous, psychologically safe surveys, bringing in external partners, for example, for that accountability to make sure that people will be heard, but also is looking at your process, looking at, if you have complaint procedures. So Susannah, just what you were describing there, that individual or your experience of confronting a person, you're in a position of senior leadership. How would you take your experience and then support somebody else on a different level to use that same tactic? What support do you have as an organization when it comes to your complaints procedures? So it's really looking at internally, what do you have, and living that inclusion that people say, the statements that we have in that organization. But start slow, understand your environment first, and then you can build up upon that. I've got a list of about 10 examples that people can take, which I'll share in the comments.
Love that. Exactly. Afterwards. Oh, good. That's brilliant. Fiona, thank you. And Phil, I suppose kind of taking that a little bit further, and just the example that Fiona's kind of highlighted there, how reliant do you think businesses are on the affected individuals pushing these initiatives? And do you think that's sort of putting too much weight on those often minority communities to kind of stand up and take those actions?
Yeah, I do. I think there is a power, though, in harnessing the passion and energy of people who are either directly or indirectly impacted through these kind of different intersectionalities. And you can get some real kind of energy through people. The challenge often is that people are trying to do work above and beyond the day job, and you're kind of not necessarily always recognized for the effort that goes into it, or the time commitment. Not everyone wants to stand up and be a role model either. Actually, kind of putting yourself out there and having this conversation is challenging and scary, and sometimes you don't know what will happen next. And that uncertainty can be a real barrier, particularly if you aren't seeing senior leadership sharing and telling stories and exhibiting the behaviours that you're expecting to see. I think there's something about legacy. People change, teams change, culture changes. These need to be things that are with us for the rest of an organization's lifespan, and not just for today and for the particular group of people who are feeling passionate about things. But I also think for me, there was probably two things that really made a big difference. One was the idea of kind of active in your allyship. And when I kind of stepped into the leadership role for Dawn, we were very much in training and awareness and supporting people. But what I wanted to do was change the firm and make sure that we were exhibiting our values, not just in what we said, but also in what we did. And that has really kind of come through over the last couple of years, where we're putting our values into practice into our behaviours. And I think the other thing is, as a junior person in the firm, I know that I was worried about kind of talking about things, and I speak to others around whether it's talking about sexuality or otherwise, and that disclosure, that redisclosure, can be quite tiring. And actually, there is an opportunity there for people to create an environment where there is trust, and sometimes that does take people who are allies of, rather than necessarily affected by, to be able to stand up and have that brave conversation and do something that's a little bit different.
And do you think, and I don't want to but we will end on a high, I promise, as we come into the last few minutes, but from a barrier perspective, is that one of the biggest barriers, almost a kind of tiredness and a having to get up and start again all the time? Maybe go to Binby. What do you see the biggest barrier to allyship? And I guess is a barrier that sort of fear of doing anything in case it's the wrong thing to do. So where are do you have some examples where organisations have come back from that and they haven't got it right? The sort of negative turns into positive, maybe.
So I guess some of the barriers that I've seen in my experience are lack of awareness of own bias, because we all do have our own bias. As mammals, naturally, even animals look at the world, and they may see, they will judge being in a position where you are fearful or you are welcoming, depending on what you say. So that lack of own bias for everybody to recognize is a massive barrier, because if you don't even recognize that you are being judging somebody, then you won't even reflect on how you are behaving. Suppressing open discussions, and as well as oversensitivity. So before we started the live, we were kind of talking about what is allyship, and Phil had asked, how would you describe allyship? And I said to Phil, well, I'm a black woman and you're a white man, so even that, it means we have different experiences. Having that openness where people can feel like they can actually say, I am bisexual, or I'm a Christian, or I'm a Muslim, and actually it not offend anybody, because I do feel that my white counterparts do sometimes feel that they can't say certain things that I would naturally feel I can say. So it's actually having that balance on both sides, that yes, along with encouraging people to be more open, then also people being less sensitive when the wrong thing is said, because the wrong things will get said at times where people don't know. So just that open culture where people can say, as long as obviously it's not intended to offend, and then people can be corrected without it having to go to HR, for example. So less tiptoeing, just having more clear, open discussions. Also, I feel like limited resources. That I do think, if I'm being honest, I've been in scenarios where most people do want to help, they do want to support, but if there isn't the resources, there isn't the funding, there isn't the training, how can people act? So also lack of opportunities, because part of allyship is collaboration. So perhaps where there is a job role that's open, offering it to somebody who may not have had the opportunity, because they may just not sit on those tables and may not walk in those rooms, having more opportunities that are open so that there is more accessibility. And then another barrier is the anxiety of being excluded. So I guess to simplify it, if I'm part of the cool crowd, for example, but then I want to bring this person who's not part of that cool crowd, I might think, well, how is that going to affect my position of where I am? Because I'm comfortable, So just that awareness that, as we can look at young children on the playground and notice that they exhibit that behavior of, I like this person who isn't part of this group, but I'm here, so I don't necessarily want to lose my position. And as adults, we don't necessarily stop doing that, So just that awareness that people may personally feel that they want to help, but there may be that restriction in themselves as well.
Yeah, and it's almost sort of recognising that it can be uncomfortable. At times it will be uncomfortable calling out, but giving people strategies as to how to confront things. I love that. Coming on to you, Fiona, and I know you've got your list of 10 resources, but as we come into the last couple of minutes, give me a few sort of next steps. Give me 5 next steps, and then we'll ask the same question to Phil.
Quite a few. The first one, just starting off with what Binby said, is actually creating that safe space, because we're not having conversations and not having that conversation on social media. So I notice sometimes I tend to ban any organisation that I work with at the very start of the relationship, working together. No posts on Twitter, Instagram, LinkedIn. Don't say anything about what you're doing. Do the work first and then really go into it, because as you're doing the work, you are going to go through the uncomfortable, especially when you're taking through your whole organisation. If you do have a diverse organisation, there are going to be things that are going to be said, or truths that you did not realize, experiences that you did not realize was happening in your organisation. So we need to work through that. So create that safe space to have these honest, frank conversations, but also have that barrier of, what is honesty and what is then going a bit too far, and providing that guideline of the Chatham House rule of conversation, that safe what is said here stays here. Right. And then we're talking about training and education. I hear from people saying, well, I can't really do this because I don't have the time to learn or read that book, or, thank you, Susannah. I think you're the only one who read that book. I'm going to check who else read the book. But creating that space as an organisation to learn together. So book clubs are great ways of bringing people together, because you're connecting. Food, I always say with everybody, food, celebrating culture. Food is such a great way to get to know the people within your organisation, where you can have rich conversation. Training, I tend to avoid the word training, because training makes things feel stale. But I think is that coming together, remembering what it's like to learn in a creative sense, but also accepting that we are going to get to positions where we might have a heated discussion. But what happens afterwards? Reviewing your policies and procedures. I really believe that a lot of companies have lots of great statements and policies. Like for everybody listening here, go back and look at your websites. Are you saying things like we're inclusive, we're diverse, we're this, we're that, but are you actually living that? Put that review out there, get people telling you in your organization. And then what do you do with that survey? So don't let that survey just be a shining statement. We've done this survey, but what do you do with it? What's the statement? What's the accountability? And again, transparency. I think in terms of one of the key things that stood out for me, for what we're talking about, why are we talking about allyship in the first place, is that equality and equity for individuals. For my side of the conversation, when it comes to racial equity, the pay gap, are people progressing within your organization? Are they getting to those positions where we're talking about promotion, where there's opportunity up there? How do you measure that? So we can start measuring that in your organization. As I said, there's loads, but I'll share more. But I think really it's, and again, celebration as well, bringing that story, review, reflect, talk about your journey, how you're getting through, but be honest with it. I've started saying to people, stop posting statements and just start posting your journey so far, because then this is a journey. This is how we move forward, rather than
all join on that. I love that.
So my kind of final thought would be, if you took away all the words and somebody was just looking at your actions, would they be able to determine your values based on your actions? And that's the thing that guides me. It's as I think all have said, it's great to have things written down on paper and to say great words, but actually what makes me proud to be at PwC at the moment and to be part of this community is that we are genuinely putting actions behind our behaviours. And that's the thing that really makes a difference.
I love that. Now, thank you everyone for a fantastic discussion. We've reached the end of our time today, but thank you for tuning in, those who were able to listen to us. I hope you found it interesting. I've certainly picked up some really valuable insights. This listening point before I go off and engage rather than sort of speaking out for people is something I really want to take away from this. This session has been recorded and we will share it on our YouTube channel. But please do reach out on LinkedIn if you have any questions and to see Fiona's top 10 tips as to things to follow up with, which we will post on. We'll be back before the end of the year with another episode. Watch it and sign up when it appears. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.